So I've been reading your meeting notices every week and paying attention to what you've been reading and discussing. And I've noticed that you've mainly focused on things like the Four Noble Truths and that kind of stuff, the stuff that comes from the Pali Canon. And that's good. So those things come from the original teachings of the historic Sakyamuni Buddha. And you find those teachings in the Pali Canon, and that's really everything else comes from that. So as most of you probably know, Buddhism started in northern India, it spread through Asia, a lot of it along the Silk Roads, so all the way over to Pakistan and that kind of area, through that whole section there. And as it spread, it encountered other cultures. So religions, not just Buddhism, but religions in general, are part of their culture. So like art, music, and all other cultural phenomena, religion is a product of its culture, and that it influences its culture. And so you find that as Buddhism spread, it through other cultures, it evolved. And then also Buddhism evolved because some very creative people had realizations that built on this foundation, on those original teachings. So these new realizations don't quite, they don't make Buddhism into something different. They sort of add to it, they change, the tone a little bit here and there and that sort of thing. But basically they make Buddhism accessible in different ways to different groups and to different individuals based on their abilities and the cultural context that they're in and that sort of thing. That affects what they can understand and what they can make use of. So this is a very complicated way for me to explain why I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about tonight, but also I figured that since you guys are largely focusing on that stuff during your weekly discussions, that when I come in, maybe we'll talk about some of the other things that come up, because it's all good, it's all useful. And some of these arose long after the passing of the historical Sakyamuni Buddha. And so they do take Buddhism into some areas that are different than what you come across in the Pali Canon, but in ways that can be useful to some of you. So let me back up just a little bit. So the Buddha's first teaching at the deer park, there's a deer, like a nature preserve outside of Varanasi. And the Buddha came after his enlightenment, and he sat with his 5 ascetic friends and gave them a discourse, which is called Setting the Wheel of Dharma in Motion. And that's where he explained the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. And then in teachings that followed not long after that, he explained the not-self characteristic and the principle of impermanence and the importance of that, and that sort of stuff. So those are 3 of the 4 seals of the Dharma. See, that's what the term that we use, the seals of the Dharma. These are the things that really package it up, that encapsulate the teachings. So dukkha, suffering, stress; anicca, impermanence; anatta, not self. And then there's nibbana, or nirvana, the possibility of freedom from the cycle that leads us back to suffering. And so those are the things that you've been talking about, so I'm not going to go into that. But what I will do is talk about some of the key teachings that arose after that, where they come from, and a little bit about how they might be useful to you, really just to kind of introduce this concept so that we can go into these in more depth later. So the second major sort of set of instructions that you might say shift our efforts away from individual liberation toward a more common good, toward having a commitment to becoming enlightened for the sake of others. And then the other part of that is that liberation comes about because of the realization of emptiness. So the sutras that deal with this kind of second set of instructions that deal with these themes are set in real places, like Vulture Peak, which is a real place you can go to. I've been there. Jim's been there. It's outside of, it's in a place called Rajgir, which is in India. But these are not historical records. They're sort of mythic in nature. So they're spiritual stories that encapsulate realizations that are congruent with, but expand on these earlier teachings. So kind of the first big distinction that happens as Buddhism grows and evolves is the difference between the arahant ideal, which is, when the Buddha taught his monks and lay followers, their objective was to become completely freed from anything that bound them to the cycle of coming and going. And you do that by becoming an arahant, a completely purified person. And so that's the objective of the Pali Canon stuff, is to become an arahant. Well, as Buddhism spread to places like China, this was seen as kind of self-serving. It's not really, but in that cultural context, it seemed selfish. And so as people saw that Buddhism made a lot of sense and that it had a lot of value and so on, it evolved a little bit. So we got the Bodhisattva ideal. This is now the objective, is that you're not trying to become completely freed from the cycle of suffering because you want to stick around to help others. And so this concept comes in of wanting to become enlightened for the benefit of all beings. This is the bodhicitta, the mind of awakening for the sake of others. And so you're resolving to awaken for the sake of all beings. And so the emphasis then is a little bit less on wisdom and a little bit more on compassion. So wisdom and compassion are both very much a part of Buddhist practice all the way from day one to now. But this emphasis becomes a little bit more in the direction of compassion. And awakening comes about because of the realization of emptiness. So emptiness is one of those words that you start running into when you start reading about Buddhism. It can be pretty confusing. Confusion is partly because the term emptiness is used in different ways to mean different but related concepts. And also it's better understood by putting it into practice rather than trying to figure it out. Now, that said, we're going to try to figure it out. So during services at White Sands and during Zen retreats and things like that, we chant a sutra that deals with emptiness. It's called the Heart Sutra. That's what we call it for short. It's really the heart, the most important part of the perfection of great wisdom teachings, the Maha Prajna Paramita teachings. So this is a whole field of instruction. So it's kind of like the Pali Canon is a whole bunch of different discourses all collected into one set of baskets. The Prajna Paramita teachings are the teachings that deal with how to perfect this sort of deep, profound wisdom. And it came about actually after 500 years or so after the Buddha's death. So the Heart Sutra is this fairly short discourse that's said to be delivered by Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva compassion, spoken to Sariputta. Sariputta was a historic figure. Avalokiteshvara probably not. Okay. So Avalokiteshvara is more like the embodiment of compassion in bodhisattva form. Anyway, it starts like this. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, doing deep prajna paramita, perceived the emptiness of all five aggregates and was freed from suffering and troubles. So some translations that we've used say Avalokiteshvara was freed from fear. In other words, he became equanimous because he had realized emptiness, doing deep prajna parami to perceive the emptiness of all five aggregates. A whole other Dharma talk there, but basically the things that we identify as us, form, feelings, perceptions, mental fabrications, and consciousness, are all empty. Now, this is the original teaching, the not self characteristic, which most of you have read and probably heard me talk about. But then he goes on to say, all things are expressions of emptiness. So I'm going to go into this in some detail later on, so don't get too worried if you're getting confused now. For now, I want you to understand just a couple of things. So prajna, wisdom, is the deepest realization, the deepest wisdom, and that is the realization yourself of emptiness. So in the teaching on anatta, we learned that the stuff that we identify as I, me, and mine is actually pretty insubstantial. There's nothing here that really belongs to me. There's nothing here that I really have much in the way of control over. And I didn't do anything to get it, right? And I don't get to decide when it goes away or what form it takes or anything like that. And not only that, but it's constantly changing and it's constantly interacting with other things. And so this is, the Buddha talked about this in the Anatta Sutta, the one that talks about the not self-characteristic. Emptiness, sunyata, is the idea that all things are free of intrinsic existence. So not only am I free of a self as a discrete thing, but so are you, and so is the internet, and everything else that we come in contact with in the sort of material world. And so the Heart Sutra basically boils down to all things are expressions of emptiness. So like I said, we're going to go into this in more depth in another talk. We'll work on unpacking the Heart Sutra together, maybe next time I'm here or the time after that. But like pretty much everything the Buddha taught, to understand it, you have to embody it. To embody it, you have to practice it. You can't really just get this in your mind. You have to work with it. But where we're headed is this. Not only am I really not self, but everything else is empty of an intrinsic self. And since there's no separate discrete self, there is oneness. So emptiness is oneness. If something has an intrinsic self, has no intrinsic self, then it's not separate from other things. And thus everything is interdependent with everything. Confused? Okay? Okay, good. So here's something else to take into consideration. The Heart Sutra is said to have been spoken at Vulture Peak Mountain about 500 years after the Buddha's death. So if the Sakyamuni Buddha was no longer alive, how could he have turned the wheel again? So like I said, religions are museum pieces. They're living things. They evolve, they change. And so enlightened people from different cultures and so on understood things differently. Other things were revealed. You hear one teaching and it leads to another one. And so the sutras that these things are embodied in are not history lessons. They're not science lessons. They're spiritual lessons. These are spiritual truths. And so there's this concept of the word of the Buddha. So the word of the Buddha includes things the Buddha said, but it also includes things that people who really got Buddhism, who really had awakened, said that were in keeping with the teachings. And so you'll see the Heart Sutra is the word of the Buddha. It is, but the Buddha in a much broader sense, the body of the Buddha that exists independently of the physical form of the Buddha himself. Okay. So the next one of these things that I'll talk about is Pure Land Buddhism. So in a nutshell, there were people who realized that Buddhism could be helpful to not just to monks and not just to people who could spend their lives practicing and dedicating to the spiritual life, but normal everyday people. And so they said there should be a path to freedom for everyone, even people who aren't very smart or who were born with pretty bad karma or have done some pretty bad things. And they sensed that there was a path like that. And so this path comes into being. We're not real sure exactly when, but around the beginning of the Common Era, some of these sutras around the Pure Land ideas begin to appear. And this is a path of faith. So liberation comes through the realization of emptiness in the Prajnaparamita teachings. Then in the Pure Land teachings, it results through faith, specifically in Amitabha Buddha, the Buddha of infinite life and light now. This is not a historical figure. There's been one Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha. But you encounter other Buddhas in these other scriptures. And Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite light and life, is really a personification of oneness. So the path of faith is kind of a challenging concept for people who, for instance, come to Buddhism because they felt alienated by some other faith tradition. But it's different, than other faith traditions in some pretty significant ways that I'll go into when we get to that point. But bear in mind that what it really boils down to is that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a monk. You don't have to be a Dharma teacher. You don't have to give up everything. And you can have done some bad stuff. You could be carrying around some karmic baggage, and you can still become enlightened. You can still become enlightened. And part of that is being aware of that, accepting that possibility is there for you. Pure Lands, by the way. So the idea with Pure Land Buddhism is that if you say that you believe in Amida Buddha, which you do by saying something like Namo Amida Butsu or Namo Adita Phat or Omitofu in Chinese, things like that, then you can be reborn in Amida's Pure Land. So Pure Lands are referred to in the Pali Canon. If you look at the stages of enlightenment, the 4 stages of enlightenment as explained by the Buddha, historic Buddha, you'll find this stage called non-returner. The idea with this is that people reach a certain point of spiritual, reach a certain spiritual point, and they don't have to come back here and suffer anymore. So where do they go? If they're going to be reborn, they're going to be reborn somewhere. And so this is where the Pure Lands come in. Pure Lands are created by Buddhas in order to be there for people who don't have to come back here. They're kind of heavenly realms, and they make it very easy for you to finish purifying yourself so that you can become fully freed from the cycle of suffering. So in Pure Land Buddhism, the idea then is kind of an extension of this bodhicitta idea, is that you're reborn in a Pure Land, and then when all beings are ready, then we all enter nirvana together. So the next turning of the wheel of Dharma is the emphasis of Buddha nature. The idea that the essential mind is pure, is untainted by delusions and misunderstandings and irrationalities and so on. And therefore, we all have the potential to become Buddhas. So arahants are not Buddhas. In the original teachings, there was a Buddha. He was the rightly self-awakened one. And then he laid down a path to freedom from suffering. And you transcended suffering by becoming an arahant. When you're an arahant, then when you died, you entered nirvana. Buddha is a little different than that. And especially in these sort of more evolved views of Buddhism, then we start seeing the idea of Buddha as being something bigger than just the end of one particular human form and the escape from the cycle of suffering. So one of the big keys is the eternality of the Buddha. So the Buddha passes away as a human being, but he's not gone. I think that maybe one of the reasons this arose is that when you spend enough time in Buddhist practice, you'll start to feel the presence of the Buddha, even though there is no Buddha, right, in the physical sense. And so how do you explain this? How do you explain feeling like you're in touch with the divine? The feelings of awe that arise sometimes, things like that, when the body and mind drops away, as Dogen talked about it, then there's not nothing. There is the glimpse of something that is beyond coming and going, that is beyond death. And so I suspect that in an attempt to answer the question, what is that we come up with this idea of the eternality of the Buddha. And so we're looking now at the Lotus Sutra, which is, if you look at it, sort of all of these different threads of explanation of what Buddhism is about, this is the one that's probably the farthest along in that sense. So we don't just become enlightened, but we can ourselves become Buddhas. And this is the main teaching of the Lotus Sutra. It presents Buddhist practice as the Buddha way, the path to Buddhahood. So those of you who go to White Sands, know now what they're talking about. Where during the dedications, it mentions the Buddha way. It's not just the path that the Buddha laid down, it's the path to Buddhahood. The Lotus Sutra explains, by the way, that this is not a separate path. It's not different from the Arahant path and the Bodhisattva path and all that kind of stuff. All those paths and practices are really part of this ultimate path to Buddhahood. So I'm going to come back to the Lotus Sutra in some detail. In fact, I was thinking about doing an intensive Thursday night thing. I want to resurrect the Thursday night meeting soon. And I thought, not right away, but fairly soon, we might delve into the Lotus Sutra. There's some really cool stuff in there, some very important things in there, but it's quite long. It's 28 chapters. Plus there's a 3-chapter introduction and a meditation at the end. So there's a lot to it. But it's very interesting, and and it will touch your heart in some ways that I think are sort of unique to the Lotus Sutra. So the question comes up, like, why do I really need all this stuff? Here, I started practicing Buddhism because it made so much sense and on this humanistic level, and it's a good way to deal with stress and all that kind of stuff. Do I really need to know all these other things? And the answer is no, not really. But these are all useful in one way or another. So, you encounter terms like Buddha nature when you're reading about Buddhism, and it helps to know where something like that comes from. If you go to White Sands, you'll hear people saying Adita Phat, which is Vietnamese for Amida Butsu. You hear variations of that at other places. But most important, these things are all tools that you can use in your own practice. So if you were drawn to Buddhism because it makes a lot of good practical sense and seems very humanistic and all that, that's fine. It's still there, But if you start to feel connections to things that maybe aren't quite explained fully in the Four Noble Truths, things like awe, the sense of connection between your practice here and now to something that transcends here and now, then these things can maybe help you to create a framework for those things and to deepen those connections. And if you feel like it's really hard to do this kind of stuff, to live the way the instructions say you have to live and all of that, we'll just say Namo Amida Butsu and know that you're not on your own. You have help. And there's been many others who have felt the same way. And just keep going. You'll be okay.